this morning. Brent crude oil down 32 cents, of sort of a third of a percent, but have a decent jump yesterday, up above $87 on Brent. So we may be seeing a new wind in the sails of Brent after the initial surge post OPEC plus shock. It had kind of plateaued. Are we seeing a little bit of a push higher? Let's kick off in China this morning because we have export numbers out of China. Let's go to Victor Yang, senior analyst at JLC Network Technology. Victor, a surprising surge in exports from China in March, up 14.8%, when it was forecast to be down 7%. That's a 21% swing. The forecasters are bonkers and blind, it seems. What's your takeaway from the China export numbers today? Should we believe in them?
Well, first of all, I would say some cargoes were delayed from January and February, which were indicated in March exports. And this happens quite well regularly, say, in 1 month, when the customs declaration is kind of affected by some factors, and this is quite normal. Say in January, where we had the holiday for the Chinese New Year, and then some cargoes, including crude cargoes too, say including the arrivals too, were delayed until February. And when the cargoes grew, some were postponed into March too. But at the same time, exports were growing because of the reopening. And, the moment China reopened, some provinces took business groups out of China to get back business. And there was this eagerness to bring, foreign customers back into China. So there has been a lot of effort, including support from the government too. And so this is no surprise too, and is mainly because of these reasons. Yeah.
Let's go to Amina Bakr, Deputy Bureau Chief, Energy Intelligence. Amina, oil prices, as I said at the intro, fell this morning despite this bionic China number. Did OPEC Plus call it right last week?
Well, the main reason, Sean, behind that surprise cut that we saw, I know that people were quite hasty and they were saying OPEC was targeting a higher price, etc. But let's go back and remember that this surprise cut came at a point where Brent was at $80. $80 was still fine for many of the budgets of these Gulf producers. So the reason behind the surprise cut was to really shake speculators in the market that were shorting the market. We saw a lot of those when the banks were collapsing, and it did cause this shock to happen. And it wanted to, I think the Saudi Energy Minister, Prince Abdulaziz, doesn't want to create an environment where speculators feel that OPEC Plus is sitting on its hands. So that's why that action was taken. It's not directly related to prices, but rather to maintain control of the market and send a strong message to speculators, basically saying that OPEC is in command here, not them.
Matt Stanley, Partnerships Lead Middle East at Kepler. Matt, I'm trying to drill into this narrative that we've all lived with now for some 3 to 6 months, that 2023 will be the year of two halves. The first a little soft, the second really tight. China will become bionic. But here we have a pretty significant data point out of China. Exports up 14.8%. Even if there's, unique reasons for that particular month, it's still a 21% swing from the Reuters poll forecast. And yet oil prices are down. Are we losing the year of two halves narrative?
Morning, mate. And morning panel. Look, I don't think this morning has got anything to do necessarily with Chinese data. It's more towards, the wider macroeconomic outlook when everyone read the minutes last night from the latest Fed meeting. A mild recession. Look, we've been listening to recession talk for over a year now. I wasn't I wasn't particularly a buyer of the second half demand story. I think it was a convenient excuse to kick the demand can down the road, which has been the pattern for the last couple of years, really. Look, WTI this morning is at a 6-month high. You know, the fundamentals are there to support it. We think the second half of this year in Asia, there will be a supply deficit of around 1 million barrels a day. Chinese, as you said, Chinese imports in March, and Victor said, you know, holidays coming up, etc. Bear in mind, we're also getting into maintenance season within China. April, May, we'll see a lot of the teapots go down. So there may be a hit on the supply side. I think, as Amina said, you know, there are myriad factors that OPEC factor in whenever making their cuts. And I think that they're not, excuse me, not just looking within the prompt in the next sort of 6 weeks. They're looking further down the line. Recessionary headwinds probably ruling things a little bit, but I mean that narrative has been there for a while. I think if you're OPEC and you've maintained a real range between 80 and 85 for the majority of the year, you're sitting happy.
Victor, the spokesman for China's General Administration of Customs, even himself isn't seeming too confident of the narrative of the year of two halves. He's saying, after the numbers were published today on the March exports, that the external environment is still severe and complicated, as he's called it, and that sluggish external demand and geopolitical factors will bring greater challenges to China's trade development this year. What does it look like to you, the China recovery now with 1/4 of the year behind us?
Well, when we look at March export data, we should not expect such growth for the second half of the year. Well, this is quite a particular month too. Say, when we look at gasoline demand, we say is about 17% higher than a year before in March. Say, when we look at oil giants, gasoline sales, and diesel sales were much higher too, but they were close to the peak level in the last quarter of last year. Say when we talk about recovery, say gasoline demand, jet fuel demand, it was much higher than the year before in March 2022, because we were hit hard by the pandemic at that time, March and April. But when you are talking about, well, the demand at the end of last year, it was just slightly stronger than that time, or largely flat to that level. So we haven't seen, well, quite strong recovery yet in the first quarter, say, but it's now picking up steam in the, say, from April, and we expect the recovery to kind of accelerate in the coming months too. Say, in May, at the beginning of May, we had a 3-day holiday, and well, it's expected that passenger travels will hit 200 million and surpassing the level in 2019. So we kind of expect faster recovery in China, but demand from the world is still kind of weak. So we do not expect the country's exports to keep growing at such a pace in the coming months. Yeah.
Amina, there's a saying in Texas that is all hat and no cattle, which essentially means, you know, you're a tourist cowboy, you're not actually a cowboy. I'm wondering, from your earlier comment regarding this announcement by OPEC Plus, is it all hat and no cattle, i.e. it was more of a shock surprise to get the short sellers out of the market than actually is it going to translate into tangible cuts of 1 million barrels a day off the market?
Yeah, actually, it's a little bit more than that if you count in the Russian barrels, if you add in the 500.
I'm kind of ignoring the Russian barrels because it's like this phantom fog, you know, you can't touch it. They just came out and said they cut 700,000 last month. I mean, it just seems more phantom to me, but the 1 million barrels from a bunch of producers who usually deliver on what they say they're going to do, that would be quite a negative outlook for the second half of the year if they would actually follow through with 1 million barrels of cuts.
Well, as you know, Sean, and you've been covering OPEC for a while, that the Gulf producers especially have a very strong track record of sticking to the cuts that they commit to. So I expect all the Gulf producers to really stick to their cuts. With Iraq, let's see, they've committed, but let's see what happens there. I mean, we've had the Kurdish, for example. Initially, we thought, okay, they might count the Kurdish barrels as part of their natural cut, but let's see how it pans out. But from the Gulf producers, I do expect them to stick to their word. But there's also a reason, Sean, that this agreement happened as a voluntary cut. It's not part of the core OPEC Plus agreement. One, because yes, the baselines are not yet matched with what producers can or can't do. Two, it was faster to get a voluntary cut in place and have the surprise factor. And three, I mean, it allows also for an amount of flexibility to happen. These cuts could be adjusted if they see a need for it to be adjusted on short notice, etc.
These are big cuts. I mean, Saudi Arabia, don't just adjust 500,000 barrels a day in an afternoon.
No, not in an afternoon. But I mean, if they need to reverse it if they say, okay, the following month we will reverse it, that's something that happens. Just like, I mean, it is possible. So that gives them a little bit of flexibility outside the agreement. And from previous, I mean, we at Energy Intelligence, we interviewed Prince Abdulaziz, and he said the OPEC Plus agreement, meaning the 2 million barrels per day cut, will stay until the end of the year. And that's still the case. On top of it, the voluntary cut is kind of a side agreement here. And it's, as you said, it was just done to shock speculators. But in terms of delivery, yeah, I do expect the Gulf producers to stick to their guns and really cut those barrels.
Matt, the other sort of story that kind of seems to be coming back into the narrative is inventories. I mean, it's a sort of a cute old thing you might tell your grandchildren. Once upon a time, the oil markets moved on a thing called inventories, but that seems a long time ago. Are inventories relevant again? You know, the weekly announcements by the EIA and the API and so on.
No, look, but Sean, you and I remember the days of fax machines and telex rooms. So, you know, those are the good old days.
I still have one in my office, a fax machine.
A telex room? That's fancy.
Well, who knows now with ChatGPT, they might come back into fashion for all of those who want a bit of privacy.
There you go. No, look, I mean, I think it's a very good point. And I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, the rage of Bitcoin getting above $30,000 and gold getting above $2,000. You know, fundamentally, what does it mean? Are they inflationary hedges? I mean, I would argue, and we laughed, that the average age of someone buying gold is probably 60, and the average age of someone buying crypto is probably 20. You know, markets are moving, the dynamics of markets are moving.
Are they both buying it for the same reason?
Yeah, I think they are. I just think the fundamentals have shifted in terms of do you want to buy a nice gold bangle, or do you want to buy some Bitcoin in the hope that it means more in the you know.
So but it's a risk off indicator rather than a risk on.
I would say so. When we were getting to that last week, you know, you've got a weaker dollar. People want to put money into other things, and oil is no exception there. Oil is an asset class that people are looking at. And on that basis, do people apply the physical fundamentals against it in order to form an argument to buy it? I'd argue no. And that means that things like inventories that were weekly indicators of where prompt demand may or may not have been. I mean, the good old days when you used to look at what Uncle Clarence and Auntie Mabel were doing for driving season in the US, is that going to be as much of a forward, you know, momentum indicator? I don't think it will. What I would say is that if you're looking at the market in the prism of the range-bound market that we've been in for the majority of this year, the inflation argument is obviously waning somewhat. You know, US inflation came lower than expected yesterday, gave the market a bit of a boost. When you've got a stable energy market, and core inflation is without food and energy, I know, people can plan a lot more. There won't be these budgetary shocks that the end user has experienced over the last couple of years. I would say that is supportive for refining margins, certainly, and should be supportive of crude. And I think that's what's given it the pop above the 85. I don't think we'll get to 100, but I think 90 is certainly within the realms of possibility. And I think it's down to stability in most markets, even though the headwinds are clearly there. I think the Fed are doing quite a good job to manage overall market sentiment right now.
Victor, I wanted to get a sort of update on China's oil imports. We went through much of last year at around the 10 and a bit million barrels a day. We seem to be up now in the 11 plus million barrels a day. What's the latest outlook for that in Q1 and looking forward to Q2? Imports of crude oil.
Well, when we are looking at Q2, we had a lot of maintenance, a lot more refineries coming under maintenance. And so we expect a slowdown in imports in the second quarter. But there are some kind of concerns about tightening supply too. So some buyers had actually stepped up their purchase for cargoes to arrive in June and July and forward. So we expect imports to pick up again, say from June, and grow faster in the second half of the year. Well, we had 2 refineries beginning commercial operation at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And so this will push up demand to some degree. And as we said in the previous section, well, Sinopec and PetroChina both plan to boost their crude ones this year. And this is kind of indicating demand growth in the demand.
What about the composition of that import? I mean, the last time we talked, you had indicated that in Q1, Russian oil made up just a little less than 20% of total imports, which was a record. Have we now moved beyond that? How big will Russian imports be in Q2 of the total?
Well, we still expect it to stay above 18% in the second quarter. And we still see quite a large number of cargoes from Russia too. And as long as the discounts remain, this will not change. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to get your views on, I mean, it's somewhat of the geopolitical question of Saudi Arabia, Iran's rapprochement, but more in the context of OPEC and OPEC plus. Obviously, Iran is a long member of many decades of OPEC, but has always been a little bit on the margins because of the sanctions it faces. Could we see this new arrangement with Saudi Arabia and China and Saudi Arabia and Iran bringing Iran more back into the center of OPEC plus?
Well, Sean, I think it's what happened with China's mediation between Saudi and Iran is really, really significant for many reasons. One, it boosts security in the entire region, which was needed. I mean, we've had these talks between Saudi and Iran happen through mediation with Iraq, with the US, but nothing really materialized. So this is really a success story, and I'm expecting security for the whole region to improve. And what's happening right now, and it's very noticeable, it's unlocking these giants in the region who happen to be oil producers. You have Iraq, you have Iran, we have potentially Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, less on the oil front, but more on geopolitical front. These are all areas where we used to see a kind of proxy war happen between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And having a kind of stable environment will enable some of these countries, I would start with Iraq first, to bring on more of its production, attract investment. And so it's good news for the upstream sector. Iran, till this point, is still under US sanctions. So it's a little bit tricky. I don't expect them to have an OPEC quota anytime soon because they won't be able to increase their production, but will eventually, I mean, over time, this help Iran in developing its upstream sector and other sectors in the country? Yes, possibly. We're not seeing signs of it yet. What we're seeing are good signs in Iraq, and possibly we will have a ceasefire before Eid starts in Yemen if things progress well, and possibly the resumption of exports in terms of oil and LNG. So what's happening is really, really significant on many fronts, politically, security-wise, and also good news for the upstream sector.
Matt, I wanted to get your thoughts and updates, obviously, from a Kepler point of view. Where are we seeing any indicators within the tanker markets that Russian crude, I sort of dismissed it earlier as being a bit of a phantom, but are we seeing it reflected anywhere that Russia are actually cutting 500 to 700,000 barrels a day, or is there any sort of indicators in the tanker markets for that? I'm not hearing Matt because he's on mute, which is
Sorry,
not very often that he is muted. But
no, I have. Yeah, that's why I've been have to
make sure we have a record of that. At 10:50 on this date, 13th of April, Matt Stanley was muted for 6 seconds.
Yeah.
Go.
Right. Sorry. Well, where were we? Russian tankers. No.
Yeah, we're seeing anything in the market of tankers
No.
or shipping that would say Russia's cutting its production?
No, look, it's a very good point, and one that needs to be addressed. There've been some articles. Our freight analysts are working on something. A lot of it has moved into the grey fleet as much as been anticipated. I think one thing that's taken the market by surprise has been the lack of stability when it's come to Russian exports. They really haven't been disrupted. There was obviously new trade patterns formed last year. That was clear for everyone to see. But in terms of crude exports, look, going back to what Victor was saying and Amina as well, you look at the numbers, March 2022, really prior the fallout by the conflict, Russia exported 29.3 million barrels to China. March this year, that figure was 50. So it's clear that and the Saudi market share hasn't really changed a lot. That's roughly the same. If anything, in March, it has increased. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is China demand is back. So that has really helped what has happened with Russian flow. If China was still locked down, I think we would be in a vastly different story. And what that means for the tanker market is, look, a lot of the Greek owners are still moving it. It's all under the price cap. You can still insure it. You can still lift it. As long as it's under the price cap and the documents are there and it's not being imported within the EU, business as normal, status quo. So nothing has really changed. Some of the flows have moved to the east coast of Russia, so Kozmino and Vladivostok, etc. A lot of those fuel oils are going to Singapore and into China, where there aren't the same bans in the EU and the States. And all that's happened is trade patterns have shifted. Instead of Russia looking west, they're looking east. And the same with their vessel and their fleets. It will probably come under more scrutiny the longer this goes on. I think we would all be extremely naive not to think that there will have to be a point where military conflict gets addressed, depending on what Zelensky does. I mean, I think he had his first ever minister since the conflict started, left for a diplomatic mission yesterday to India. So I think that they're reaching further out. So I think that once we hear the narrative that's coming out of those meetings, which will be high-level meetings, I think that there may be some additional sanctions, and that may then affect the tanker market. But for now, it seems status quo.
Let's go to the survey question before we go to the last round of comments. Just picking up on what I was saying earlier, oil prices fell after China announced today that exports unexpectedly surged nearly 15% in March year on year. Because market is losing faith in China recovery narrative. Oil prices fell because market is losing faith in China recovery narrative. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? Despite the big surge in exports, oil prices fell because the market is losing faith in China recovery narrative. Victor, I wanted to get your update on, we have reports out as we saw last year, possible power shortages coming to China again this summer, a big turn towards coal to try and sort that out. What's your outlook for the summer power outages and where coal will fill the gap?
Well, over the past, say, 2 years or so, well, sometimes power shortages happen in some areas. This is not unusual. But in not in a large scale, say, but in 2021 and 2022, there was a large scale power shortage, say in September and October 2021, and last summer in Southwest China because of extreme weather. And this happens because one reason is the transition to new energy and the cut in coal consumption. And say in some areas, well, this happens, say when manufacturing peaks, but it's not quite a significant phenomenon if there's no extreme weather. Well, so in this summer, it depends on the weather too. Say if extreme weather hits another region, and this could be worse. But otherwise, you would just see kind of a slight shortage of power.
Amina, I wanted to get your analysis on the reaction to the OPEC Plus decision. A few months ago, when OPEC Plus made the 2 million barrel a day cut in October, there was a massive reaction from Washington and from many other consumers, and because of the scale and the potential impact it may have had on inflation and so on. And there was a lot of diplomatic maneuvers by Riyadh to try and counter that narrative. But on this occasion, what one might argue is even a more surprising and shocking announcement, and not a dissimilar amount if you add in the Russian total. And yet there's been fairly muted reaction from the West and from Washington. How do you read that? How does that look going forward?
I think the context is very different, Sean. I mean, that cut took place, the one in October, the 2 million barrel per day cut took place when you had the midterm elections, and that really charged the environment ahead of time. So that's why the reaction was more explosive because it was political. This time, yes, it was really muted, and we found out from the White House that they were told ahead of time that this was coming. It's not like the other cut was not also. I mean, OPEC did inform the U.S. that the 2 million cut was happening, but it just happened in a different context. So that's why I think it was more of a muted reaction. And we're even seeing statements, I mean, overnight from the U.S. that they are going to be refilling SPR. I still have my doubts. I mean, they said they're going to refill when prices were around $70. We're way above that at the moment. So let's see how that materializes.
We do have a very big story on that's basically the headline on Bloomberg today, Bloomberg.com, the US Saudi oil pact breaking down as Russia grabs the upper hand. That's the, as they call it, the big take. As I say, it's the front page headline on Bloomberg.com today. That narrative is bedding in. Is it unfounded, or how do you see that? Because it's been around a while, this breakdown. There's increasing evidence that there's truth in it. But what is your sense look on that?
I think they're just looking at it. I mean, specifically to the article that you mentioned, they're looking at it in political context with the war still ongoing. Russia still needs a higher oil price, et cetera, et cetera. Are all the factors helping Russia reach that higher oil price? Sure. But I would say we're at a moment in time where OPEC producers and especially Gulf producers are really emphasizing that it's time to put their own national interests ahead of everything. And this is what's really unique about what's happening, not just in the oil market, but politically too. And that's why we're seeing agreements like the resumption of diplomatic ties with Iran, because it is in Saudi Arabia's interest to have peace in the region and go ahead with its diversification plans. It needs to go through these kinds of moves. And to me, it's just a matter of preserving or putting their own national interests first. It's no longer America first, it's Saudi first, it's the UAE first, it's Bahrain first, Oman first.
How about Mr.
Mr.
Wahid? Let's
we have our own set of problems there. Let's not
start. Let's get the survey result. Oh, there's a big whack. That totally disagree with that thesis. There's still a lot of faith in the recovery narrative of China. Matt, you started off your comments saying this morning, and I wanted to finish with it because it was the big news overnight. The Fed minutes, the outlook of whether more interest rates, more tightening, jobs numbers are still supporting. It seems there's still a consensus to more tightening on Fed rates. Is that relevant for the oil market still, do you think, going forward?
Yeah, look, and I think it's a good point. I think to use a phrase of yours, your favorite, I think 25 basis points is baked in the cake, Sean. I think people are focusing perhaps too much on the pivot point. You know, when the Fed pivots, some people think Q4. I think that's probably the main driver between the first half, second half narrative, as I said before. Ultimately, I think what will drive markets, oil markets specifically now, because I think the focus will be taken away from the Fed, will be what happens with oil demand. You know, coming into driving season, what happens in Europe. It's ironic that, you know, the buying season for natural gas in Europe is now probably 4 months earlier than it used to be, because, you know, stocks are doing well right now. It was a relatively mild winter. LNG buyers are going to start looking now for restocking back in the summer. So I think that the demand narrative is really what's going to drive it. The Fed meeting minutes, they were hawkish for the bulls are out there and they jumped on it. So essentially, I think you might see the market move away from what Jay Powell's doing and more to what's actually happening in all the markets vis-a-vis demand.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. We didn't even get a chance to talk about the arsenal and them holding.
I'm going to mute myself again.
They're going to hold their bottle, so to speak. It'll be a fascinating run in. We'll have to see where gasoline prices go at the pump in the US to know if there will still be a reaction to the OPEC decision last week, because the indicators there are that we're on a similar trajectory that took us in June 2022 to a record high gasoline average price across America, above $5 a gallon. Will we see that again? And all of the turmoil that comes with US politics when that happens, I think that is something to watch. Thank you so much. As always, great to have Matt Stanley from Kepler, Amina Bakker from Energy Intelligence, and Victor Yang from JLC Network Technology. Really appreciate you joining us this morning as oil prices trade a little bit down from $87 on Brent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.